I can see your slides, Elisa, so I hope that means everyone else can as well.
If not, I'll just talk at you, Ellen. Hopefully everyone can see that now. Great. So yes, thank you very much for having us today. We're delighted to be here as well. And thanks for the introduction. I work at Northumbria, as Ellen has said, and although Robbie's at a different institute at Cambridge, the two of us have collaborated together for many years now, and the research we're discussing today is joint research that we've done. You'll also see my email address on this slide, and a genuine open invitation. Please do, as well as asking questions today, which we're really looking forward to, please do feel free to get in touch after the event as well. This topic is my main area of research and research interest, so I'm always very happy to talk about it further. So as a bit of background, first of all, this first part is probably no surprise to any of you, and the numbers of attendees today probably speak to this as well. Attachments had a very long-standing place within social work theory and social work education. Bowlby, back in 1955, presented to the Association of Psychiatric Social Workers. In the 2011 Monroe Review, Eileen proposed that one of the minimum capabilities for child and family social workers is knowledge of attachment, how to use that knowledge to assess a child's current developmental state. The NARI Review again mentions attachment. It's in the PCF, lots of mentions of attachment in social work. But there has been quite a polarized debate about what place attachment theory should have in social work and whether there should be more emphasis on it. People like David Shemming's a major advocate, but also some critique and some suggestions that attachment theory has become too dominant a perspective in social work practice by people such as Sue White and Paul Garrett. And this debate about what place attachment theory should have is also quite politicized. So in the NARI Review, suggesting that there should be more teaching on attachment, but less teaching on injustice, for example. One of the interesting things about this debate, though, is that the attachment theory that has been the subject of this debate of should we have more or less is actually about a version of attachment theory that's strangely antiquated, a version of attachment theory that's focused on the idea of the child-mother bond, categories of insecurity that are presumed to determine later development. And yet there have been many developments in attachment theory since those ideas, and even Bowlby and Ainsworth, some of the originators of the theory, regretted that focus on just children and mothers, categories of insecurity, etc. So to understand more of this situation, both the debate itself and why the debate was focused on this very narrow, antiquated version of attachment theory, we undertook, Robbie and I and other colleagues of ours, undertook some research. So we've reviewed the existing published positions, concerns, research findings. We've also carried out new research of our own with children's social workers, and we've consulted with international attachment researchers. So today, what we're going to do in a relatively short period is try to summarize some of the key findings of our research and the consultation. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do add things to the chat as we go, and there'll also be time for discussion in the second half today. And again, please do feel free to email to get in touch after the event with your thoughts and your comments. So turning first to some of the previous commentary on this topic about what place attachment theory should have in social work practice and what attachment theory is when we talk about that place. The attachment research community itself have raised concerns in recent years about misunderstandings of attachment theory that are in general circulation, and concerns that social workers could therefore be drawing on those misunderstandings that are in circulation. And Robbie, who is here presenting with me today, also highlighted in some work of his published in 2020 that links between academic attachment research and social work practice are weak. So that up-to-date research isn't reaching practice always. And Robbie reviewed a lot of textbooks on attachment that introduce attachment theory ideas, and found that a lot of those are often focused on attachment categories, and some have some inaccuracies within them. And to complicate matters further, in a paper we published in 2021, we identified that a number of divergent forms of attachment discourse have developed in different domains. So we identified there's a child welfare attachment discourse that's focused on attachment categories, which differs from the academic attachment discourses, and differs again from the attachment discourses that are in popular circulation among parents and others. And furthermore, attachment terms also have multiple, sometimes quite contradictory meanings, including some everyday meanings which are different from the meanings for those terms in attachment theory. So that leads to further risk of miscommunication, of misunderstandings, and potentially of us talking past each other without realizing we're doing so, because we're all using the same terms and assuming shared understanding when that shared understanding might not always be there. So a complicated picture. In terms of some of the previous research that has been done, and what I've highlighted on this slide is some studies that were conducted in the UK in fostering and adoption contexts. The previous research seems to show that attachment is often mentioned, but in ways that are not always consistent and not always linked to attachment theory. And looking at one of those studies there, the last one on the slide, reflecting on their study findings, Morrison et al. Proposed there was therefore a risk of disconnect with attachment theory becoming rhetoric or being misused. So turning now to the new research that we carried out, to my doctoral research, we wanted to take an in-depth look at how social workers conceptualize and understand attachment theory. Wanted to look at what is attachment theory to social workers, and what sense do they make of it. It was a qualitative study, so it was a small scale depth study. We had 23 children's social workers taking part, recruited from 2 English local authorities. And that research involved in-person interviews. What we did first of all was we presented 2 family cases containing child welfare concerns. And we asked the social workers to respond to those cases, to talk about the level of risk, possible reasons for why various family members were behaving the way they were, what outcomes they expected for the children based on the situation they were in, and what they would do next. And one of the things we did is we didn't mention attachment in the recruitment materials, and attachment wasn't mentioned in that first case at all. So there was an opportunity to see if and how the social workers themselves spoke about attachment or used attachment theory ideas. And then after the 2 cases, we asked further questions, so asking the social workers about their views on theory in general, then narrowing down to their views on attachment theory and their thoughts on its relevance for practice. So through this research, we were able to both observe how social workers drew or not on attachment language and attachment theory ideas, but also gather the social workers' own perspectives on what they were doing and their views on the use or not of attachment theory. So what did we find in that research? I think a caveat here is we found a lot, What I focused on in today's findings here is some of the findings around how the social workers understood attachment theory, but we also looked at how they use and apply attachment theory. So again, people who are interested in knowing more about these findings, please feel free to ask questions or contact me after. But in terms of some key findings on what social workers thought attachment theory was and how they understood it, one of the standout findings, though not surprising to me, having been working with social workers, being involved in social work education for a while, is that the social workers in the study were generally very thoughtful and careful in how they reflected on attachment. And although that wasn't surprising to me from my previous work with practitioners, it counters some previous portrayals by people such as Garrett and White that social workers are insufficiently critical about attachment theory and how it's applied to practice. That wasn't the experience here. Something that was very interesting, though, in this research was that we found a distinction emerging between attachment as a phenomena and attachment theory. So attachment was often conceptualized as a broad, diffuse concept, as a phenomenon, so about enduring key relationships, especially child-caregiver relationships. Whereas attachment theory was seen as one theory that provides one means of understanding that phenomena of attachment, that phenomena of key relationships. So attachment was very broad, but attachment theory was often seen as something far narrower in scope than the theory actually is. And this distinction between attachment and attachment theory also helped to highlight a key way in which some misunderstandings and miscommunications could arise. So what we found in the research was that when social workers were, say, referring to potential attachment difficulties and using a phrase such as "there may be attachment difficulties here," it wasn't always clear if they meant general difficulties in the child-caregiver relationship. So if they were using the word attachment as that broader phenomena, we're not attempting to make any links to attachment theory, or whether through that term attachment difficulties, they were trying to indicate that they had suspicions that a child might have an insecure attachment to a caregiver in an attachment theory sense, and drawing on all the weight of the research related to that. I also mentioned that attachment theory was often conceptualized quite narrowly. And what we found there in terms of what that narrow looked like is that social workers were often relying on quite outdated ideas about attachment theory, mainly focused around the attachment patterns identified by Ainsworth in The Strange Situation. And that's what appears to have been dominant in their introduction to the theory. It's also what appears to be dominant in a lot of the texts in circulation about attachment theory for social workers. And so that supports those prior suggestions that that link between the latest academic attachment research and social work practice are weak. It's also quite useful to note there that it's often not that other aspects of attachment theory were known about but in limited depth, but that they were sometimes entirely outside of awareness. And obviously that changes matters, because what that meant is that for some social workers, because they saw attachment theory as just this narrow thing, they were turning away from attachment theory because they didn't know that there were these other aspects that might be useful to aid the thinking. But despite that being a kind of a predominant way that attachment theory was conceptualized, there was substantial variation across the sample in the depth and breadth of understanding of the theory displayed, much more so than previous commentaries have proposed and assumed. And that was all the more noteworthy considering this was a relatively homogenous sample, all social workers, all children's social workers, all from a single region and just 2 local authorities. So still a lot of variation. Again, that can potentially lead to some miscommunication as well. And a further thing of interesting note in relation to the variation is that social workers' level of understanding of attachment theory and their kind of self-assessment of their own understanding was not always aligned. And that's something that previous studies haven't always been able to examine, because previous studies have tended to either observe or ask social workers for assessments, not do both. And that lack of alignment wasn't all in one direction either. So some previous research from Europe has raised concerns about social workers possibly being overconfident about their knowledge of attachment theory, and has raised concerns that that might lead to misuse. But in this research, we also found that there were social workers with some really good, deep, nuanced understanding of attachment theory, but who had quite low confidence in their level of understanding of the theory. And there were also social workers who had limited knowledge but were aware of this. So again, those suggestions that all social workers are just overconfidently using attachment theory was not held up by this research. And a final noteworthy finding, which again challenged some of those previous portrayals, is that some of the previous research suggests that attachment theory is a dominant perspective and influence. But this current study found that although there was widespread awareness of attachment theory, that didn't translate into attachment being a dominant perspective. There were lots of other explanations given for behaviour, lots of other both theories and models drawn on to think about possible implications. So overall, therefore, thinking about our research and also the previous research before that, despite commentators such as Monroe and Neri emphasising the importance of child and family social workers being provided with a comprehensive understanding of attachment theory, our study suggests that that's not consistently occurring at present. Some social workers do have that comprehensive understanding, but it's not consistent across the board. So it suggests that more needs to be done to improve the links between academic attachment research and the information on that is shared with social workers. More needs to be done to update the information that's coming out. So to help address this, Robbie and I and our collaborators undertook a consultation with attachment researchers about what attachment theory concepts and research findings should be on the qualifying curriculum for social work. So given the limited time that is available and all the many things that social workers need to know, what are the core ideas that would be useful? And since then, we've developed a proposal for a draft curriculum, which has also been shared with social workers for consultation and will soon be being submitted for publication. So researchers identified 8 areas which are supported by contemporary, so by up-to-date attachment research, and which they feel are most useful for practitioners working in children and family settings to know. So that's what we'll now turn to, those 8 ideas. And I guess what I would encourage you to do as I talk through these 8 ideas is to think about to what extent these match to what you would have identified as the core ideas from attachment theory that you've been introduced to in the past. So the first of these core ideas is the idea of a safe haven. Infants and children tend to want to seek one or more of their familiar caregivers as a safe haven when they're hurt, anxious, distressed, alarmed. So do adults. This is a lifespan need. even if that's expressed differently. The idea that I can talk to my husband after this session if it goes badly is sometimes enough. That idea, that knowledge of mutual availability for support between friends, romantic partners. The idea of the safe haven is really the heart of attachment theory. It's what John Bowlby was ultimately pointing to with the concept of attachment, but the concept of the safe haven is more specific and less ambiguous. That concept of seeking one or more familiar caregivers when they're anxious, distressed, or alarmed. So one of the most important aspects of the idea of the safe haven for practitioners is that it highlights that caregivers are not interchangeable once children have a well-established relationship with them. And also that children need substantial time and interaction to build up their sense of trust in a caregiver's availability and responsiveness to the needs. So the concept also indicates, conversely therefore, that long-term separation from caregivers, for instance, due to incarceration or hospitalization, can weaken children's trust in their caregivers' availability and responsivity, and that in turn can hinder their development. Where a child's relationship with caregivers does have to be ended, for instance, to protect a child from maltreatment, or where a child loses a caregiver through death, children can develop expectations about the availability and responsivity of new caregivers in times of need. But that again takes time to build up and requires continuity of care from those new caregivers. Then to the next idea, security. Attachment theory and the research to support and develop it has found that children develop expectations built up from their day-to-day experiences about the relative availability and responsivity of their familiar caregivers in times of need. And where children have learned from experience that a caregiver will provide help when needed, that sense of trust in attachment theory is referred to as security. Where children have less trust that a caregiver will provide help when needed, that's when attachment theory is used in the term insecurity. That's what it means in attachment theory. And contrary to one of the stereotypes about attachment in circulation, one of these misunderstandings that attachment researchers have expressed concern about, these expectations are not set in stone. Security or insecurity does not become fixed. Children's expectations can and do change when caregivers revise their response to children's bids for comfort and protection. Though, as you would expect, because this sense of trust is built up from interactions, there may be a lag. So, as an example, where a caregiver experiences stressful events in their life or becomes more isolated from friends and family, that is then generally associated with increased child caregiver insecurity. Now, again, coming back to this idea of some of the misunderstandings in circulation, it's easy to find both overstated and understated claims about the impact of differing levels of security and attachment relationships. An excessive weight has sometimes been placed on single studies with extreme findings that actually aren't representative. But when we look across studies and therefore get a much clearer picture of the true associations here, the associations, so the relationship between children's sense of security in their caregiver's help and those children's later outcomes, are highly notable and so give a clear signal to us that these experiences are important. However, the strength of those links do not imply that all or even most children with insecure attachment experiences will necessarily have negative outcomes or vice versa. So it's an important thing to consider, but by no means something to overstate. The next of the ideas that attachment research has identified is the idea of the importance of a network of relationships. So children are predisposed, as we've seen, to identify a few caregivers as potential safe havens, provided they have those sufficient interactions with them to experience those caregivers as familiar. And attachment theory and research holds that multiple relationships that serve as a safe haven can be an asset for children. They do not typically disturb one another unless one relationship represents, say, a source of threat to another relationship. Now, again, coming back to these misunderstandings in circulation, attachment theory is often assumed and often criticised, following Bowlby's early writings, to emphasise the importance of the child-mother relationship at the expense of other child-caregiver relationships. But Bowlby was surprised that people took this idea from his work and clarified in his later writings that was not his intention. So what we now know from the research is that having access to a network of potential safe haven relationships increases the likelihood that a child will have someone they can feel free to turn to in a manner that satisfies the needs, which will support the common sense and the experience that you all have, but perhaps reassuring to see that attachment theory does support rather than contradict that knowledge that you will have already from practice. And furthermore, the support for childcare and the support for caregivers themselves provided by the additional network members, for instance, if grandparents are also part of that network, can increase the capacity of those other caregivers to be available as a safe haven for their child. So there's indirect as well as direct benefits to that network for children. Further support from research to debunk the myth that attachment theory focuses only on mothers. Researchers have found that the care provided by fathers and mothers carries a similar weight for children's later behavioural development. And compared to children with one secure attachment relationship and one insecure relationship, children with two secure attachment relationships overall have fewer behavioural difficulties, stronger language skills. So again, that is a strength. So in general, therefore, children who have no secure attachment relationships with any member of their network are the ones who are most at risk of adjustment difficulties and mental health difficulties. Turning to the fourth idea, stable, non-abusive family-based care. Institutional care has a number of features that appear to interfere with the capacity of children to experience that there are people available to them as a safe haven. So those include things such as the possibility in that institutional care of high staff-child ratios, staff turnover, and some of those qualities of professional distance that are sometimes encouraged, or just structurally become necessary. So child welfare professionals, when making decisions about permanency, should try and include among their complex considerations that institutional care or other highly unstable caregiving arrangements might prevent or hinder children's access to relationships that can provide that safe haven for their development. And when children do experience non-familial care, for instance, incarcerated young people, professionals working with those children might also want to proactively consider what safe haven access can be maintained with the existing network, and also potentially is feasible within those professional caregiving relationships. Turning now to sensitivity. Children will be more likely to trust in the availability and responsivity of their caregiver as a safe haven. You can see we keep coming back to this idea of a safe haven. If that caregiver is able to identify and respond to the child's intentions and needs. So that's especially the case for any signals that the child is hurt, anxious, distressed, and alarmed, because that is when the child is seeking that caregiver as a safe haven. Now, sensitivity is one of the many words from attachment theory, where attachment researchers and theorists are using the term sensitivity in a very particular way that actually is not the same way that we might use the word sensitivity in everyday language. So when attachment researchers use the term sensitivity, what they are meaning is the ability of the caregiver to perceive and interpret accurately the signals and communications implicit in their child's behaviour, and given that understanding, to respond to those signals appropriately and promptly. So it's both about understanding of your child's needs and the response. Interventions that have been developed that focus on seeking to improve caregiver sensitivity, where that has been the target of the intervention, have been shown to improve children's expectations about their caregivers' availability, also increasing their observable reliance on the caregiver as a safe haven, and in turn their developmental outcomes. So in other words, having caregiver sensitivity as a focus of intervention has been found to be very useful. And in the context of child protection assessments, researchers have also examined how caregivers' responses to those interventions to improve their sensitivity might offer insight into the caregiver's capacity to improve their parenting. And the findings suggest that the caregiver's responses to the intervention can provide useful insights there. Mentalising now. Beyond observable behaviours, so beyond that caregiver sensitivity, researchers have also looked at some of those psychological processes that influence whether caregivers are available as a safe haven for their children. And one such process is mentalising, and that refers to a person's capacity to consider thoughts and feelings when making sense of their own and others' behaviour and experiences. So thinking about those underpinning thoughts and feelings to make sense of behaviour. And you can see, if you think about that specific definition of sensitivity that attachment researchers have, you can see how mentalising would be useful, because it therefore is an aid for those caregivers to interpret correctly their children's signals and underlying needs. So practitioners might find the concept of mentalising relevant to drawing attention to the value of caregivers' psychological experience of their child. And practitioners might gain some insight into the dynamics of families by considering how caregivers seem to think about the experience of their child, and how caregivers seem to think about what might be going on for their child as different possible explanations for their behaviour. Turning to the seventh of the 8 key ideas. alarming caregiver behaviour. Attachment researchers have found that alarming behaviour by a caregiver can have a particularly negative effect on a child's expectations of that caregiver as a safe haven. If a child associates their caregivers with alarm, that can make it difficult for them to use them as a safe haven. Now, it's important to emphasise, and attachment researchers do emphasise, that if a child experiences their caregiver as alarming, that by no means necessarily indicates abuse by that caregiver. Though, of course, that is one possible way that a caregiver can be alarming. But there are various other caregiver behaviours that might alarm a child, depending on the child's age and the situation. So a frightened caregiver can be alarming for a child, not just a frightening caregiver. Now, another thing that's quite useful to think about in terms of this concept of alarming caregiving is that a caregiver may be very sensitive in that attachment sense of sensitive that we've looked at, but nonetheless sometimes alarming. For example, a mother who has experienced sexual assault might find her son alarming, but potentially only at particular times during nappy changes and bath time, and might be a very sensitive caregiver. So in other words, practitioners might find it helpful to observe and attend to both insensitive and alarming caregiving behaviours in supportive work with families, and recognise that caregivers may be struggling with one but not necessarily both. Researchers have also developed now an assessment tool for use by applied practitioners to help identify alarming caregiver behaviours. The work validating that measure is still underway. So that's a little bit of a watch this space suggestion there. And now turning finally to the eighth and final of these key ideas from attachment that researchers have suggested are particularly useful. Poverty and adversity. Experiences of poverty and other socioeconomic stresses can reduce the attention that adults have available for parenting. It can decrease those caregivers' positive feelings, and it can increase feelings of helplessness and fear in those caregivers. So, as would be expected, therefore, any such stressors are associated with an increased likelihood of less sensitive caregiving, with an increased likelihood of greater frequency of alarming caregiver behaviours, and with an increased likelihood of reduced capacity for mentalising. So it makes sense then, and the research findings have supported this idea, that family adversity is linked to greater likelihood of attachment insecurity. Now, I talked at the beginning about some of these debates in attachment theory and its place being politicised, and the Neri review argued that attachment theory implies that practitioners should focus on parents and their behaviour rather than their circumstances to make improvements in the life of children. But what these findings show is that that's a false opposition. Any circumstance that makes parents routinely feel helpless or afraid or overwhelmed is likely to have a negative impact on their children's perceptions of their parents' availability and responsivity in times of need. So again, attachment research supports thinking more holistically and thinking about the interaction between attachment processes, caregiver behaviour, and the wider circumstances of the family. And again, I suspect that it will be useful to, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I suspect this is something that fits very much with most people's viewpoints and experiences to date. But again, hopefully reassuring to see that attachment theory doesn't actually propose that we should silo focus on attachment and parent-child behaviour, but actually should consider those wider factors too. So in conclusion, and I appreciate I've rattled through this because I think I really would particularly welcome and think it will be particularly useful, hopefully for you all to have that chance to get out of this what you need with those questions in the Q&A part of the session. There have been lots of development in attachment theory since the 1980s. So what we would like to propose is that we might consider moving on from teaching and from focusing in our further learning about attachment on infant mother bonding and categories of insecure attachment, as if that was the heart of the theory. As hopefully I've given you a little flavour, contemporary attachment research is quite different. It emphasises those networks of relationships, not just mothers and infants. It highlights the effects of poverty and adversity. It highlights that these patterns and relationships are not fixed and do respond to changes. So rather than focusing on categories of insecurity, the important thing we would argue is understanding whether children feel supported and feel trust that they have people there to help them when they need that help, and not about putting children into boxes and giving them labels. And based on the research, the direct research with social workers that we conducted, would also suggest that it's really important for us to think about the language we use when talking about child caregiver relationships and when talking about ideas and findings from attachment theory. So I've already given some examples of some of the miscommunication and talking past each other that can happen. Use of the term attachment really can misdirect attention. So, for instance, when attachment gets treated as an equivalent to the whole relationship rather than a specific part of it, we lose some of those nuanced differences about different parts of the relationship and the importance of thinking about them all. Or when attachment gets treated as a quality of the child rather than a specific aspect of a child's experience of the relationship. Again, that's when we can start to fall into some of these labeling traps and traps of viewing these things as fixed rather than as about responsive to the environment and the relationships and changes within them. So that is all I want to cover in the direct talk. I will in a second hand over to Ellen to decide whether you would like a breakdown before the breakout discussions, but I'm really looking forward to the chat going forward on this.
Thank you so much, Sarah. What power to have, what power to have. Should we go into breakout rooms first or breaks later? I feel like this is the time to have a Zoom poll, if any, but I don't think we can manufacture them quite that quickly. But thank you so much, Sarah, for talking us through that. That's really, really interesting and also really thought-provoking, I think, in terms of how do we use attachment theory in our work, and how do we use it effectively, and what do we mean by it, and do we all talk about the same thing? So lots of food for thought there. I will give you a break because it's always good to have a little break. So I'm going to give you, I'm looking at the time, it's 10 minutes to 3. So I will give you, please be back here by 3. So I'll give you 9 minutes or whatever it is, works out as 10 minutes. Be back here by 3, but make yourself a cup of tea. I'm going to have a biscuit because it's definitely biscuit time. So I will have biscuits. I hope you all get a biscuit too if you're that way inclined. And we'll come back in, we'll put you into breakout groups where there'll be small breakout groups and it'll be an opportunity for you to think about. And thank you, Sarah, for sharing that. Some thoughts, we'll put that in the breakout group so you know what to talk about. But there's just some ideas around questions that you might want to reflect on in your conversations, and we'll give you a little bit of time to talk to colleagues about that in your breakout rooms. So really interesting kind of for reflections and discussions there. But I will let you go now and stretch your legs or pop to the loo or whatever, have a biscuit, and we'll see you back here at 3 p.m. And thank you again so much, Sarah, for that really interesting presentation. And I'll see you all very shortly.
Of course, enjoy your biscuit.
I hope you get one too, Sarah. I hope everyone gets a biscuit.